Hello, I'm Penny Thornton and welcome to my astrology channel. Now, this is where I take a look at what's going on up there and try to figure out not only what's happening in global terms, what's happening on the global stage, but also in our individual lives. And I'm certainly going to talk about that this week because we are living in very challenging times. I don't think there's another way of saying it. There isn't a part of the globe that isn't affected by the coronavirus at the moment, and it is really very reflective of what I'm going to be talking about in the astrology on this video. And what I'm also going to do, I hope, is enable you to see that we're not really helpless victims, but that we can always work with what we've got, one of my favorite sayings, and there are ways to work with the situation that we have right now. And as I said, hopefully by the time I've got to the end of this video, you'll all be with me on that score. So what I'm going to be talking about is the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. It's a very important conjunction. It's not that rare. It happens every 13 years, but it's important. We've got Jupiter, the big planet with the big red spot, and Pluto, yes, all right, our celestial dwarf, but actually it's a planet by any other name. And we've been working with Pluto and what it means in terms of personality and character and destiny, and also what its processes are in global terms as well. We've been doing this for almost 100 years. So we have really tested the Pluto hypothesis. So we know what we're talking about, we astrologers do, whether it's called a celestial dwarf or it's still part of our planetary team. So putting these two planets together is a mighty conjunction. And one of the ways I work with my students is that I get very early on, in fact, right from the very start of things, let's work with keyword principles. So we attach a keyword to everything in astrology, and then you start moving the building blocks around so that we can start to work and see how things might behave, what they might mean in terms of global events and personal lives. So with Jupiter, the key word we're working with is growth and also expansion, which is kind of the same thing. And with Pluto, we're working with transformation. So we've got growth and transformation on a massive scale. Because one of the things about Jupiter is also this idea of great, of huge. And with Pluto, we've got transformation. And we can see this is transforming society, it's transforming lives on a really massive scale. Now, before I get into all this, I want to look at what happened the last time Jupiter and Pluto were together. Now, they were together in the sign of Sagittarius, and this was at the very end of 2007, December 2007, just tipping in to 2008. And Pluto was about to fully enter Capricorn, and Jupiter not far behind it. So we almost had a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, but not quite. But why is this significant? Well, if you remember 2007, 2008, this was the beginning of the global economic meltdown, really, the huge crisis that we had with banking, with, well, everything changed our lives. We changed our habits, or maybe not enough, because when we look at the preceding Jupiter and Pluto conjunction, it has a relationship with the next one. And what are we experiencing right now as a result of the coronavirus is that, again, we're in, well, the global economy is in a meltdown state. So did we learn enough lessons from the past, individually and collectively, in terms of banking and finance? Probably not, which is why we're having another go at it. And it would seem this time, certainly with the measures most governments are taking in the world and really throwing money at this, instead of halting the money supply, which is what happened in 2007, 8, and we entered the age of austerity. What we're doing now is just taking huge amounts of money and throwing it out there so that the population can survive. So I would suggest that that's a major step forward. Now, coming back to the idea of keyword principles, and we're looking at Jupiter's principle of expansion and growth and Pluto transformation, we also need to look at the downside of this and have a look at inflation, which has a negative aura about the idea of growth. This is when things get out of control. And also, of course, we have Pluto's main keyword, elimination. So we're both eliminating lives and livelihoods on a mass scale. And that perfectly fits our Jupiter-Pluto brief. Now, there's another very interesting aspect to this, and I'm very grateful to astrologer Patrick Watson for this, because he suggested a little bit before this time, in fact, not as we're going through it, that there was something about magnification, about a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. And he looked back in time at all the times Jupiter and Pluto have not just been in conjunction, but have been in opposition or square. So we have a Jupiter-Pluto theme going for us. And he noticed this idea of magnification, making small things bigger. And we looked at this in the sense of the magnification of tiny organisms, tiny forms of life. And we look at that in 1657, actually with a Jupiter-Pluto opposition. And that was the realization or the discovery of tiny, tiny, tiny little microisms. Gosh, can't find my words today. But when we come forward in time to 1930 and we have the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in Cancer, the electron microscope was developed. And that too, of course, made little tiny things enormous. And so coming to this present time, this present Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, what do we have but a tiny little virus? You can't even see it. Well, at least with the naked eye. It requires magnification to see it. And what else do we get? We get this magnification of a virus spreading out throughout the world and causing devastation. So we can see how in our astrological language, how Jupiter and Pluto really apply precisely to what we're going through at this point in time. I also want to make a point here about Pluto. You know, we get a lot of our understanding about how Pluto works from mythology. And we know that all the planets are called after Roman gods. So we have Pluto being the Roman god of the underworld and being taken into deep and dark places where, in fact, there is rich treasure to be found. Very important to get that connection. In Greek mythology, Hades was the ruler of the underworld. But interestingly enough, Plutos was the Greek god of wealth. It had to do with money. And again, we can see how uncannily the resonance is uncanny between, amongst what we're living with right now. That idea of how much it's affected our wealth, the wealth of governments, of countries, of individuals, of survival. So we have Pluto in that aspect, as well as, the idea of transformation and finding riches in the experience that Jupiter and Pluto are giving us. Now, I also want to look at the idea of Pluto, or Pluto's invisible helmet, or rather the helmet that rendered him invisible. Because, of course, we can't see this virus with the naked eye, and we can't see it being transmitted, which is a really scary thing. I mean, we can't see it floating through the air. We can't see it on surfaces, but it's there. And that too is an aspect of Pluto, the invisibility, and also of Jupiter's magnification, of making the effects of that absolutely huge. Now, this time round, we can't just isolate Jupiter and Pluto and call that a conjunction, and that's the only thing we're looking at, because Saturn is in there as well. And in fact, at the beginning of the year, in the early to middle part of January, we had the almighty Saturn-Pluto conjunction, around about the 11th, 12th, 13th of January. Now, in fact, that was the point at which in China, doctors were being alerted to the idea that we really, really did have a potentially dangerous virus on our hands that was going to spread. And of course, you know the rest. I'm not going to point fingers and name names at this point, but that's actually where it began. And although it took us until, late February and early March to start to see the financial markets melting down and the huge scale of this coronavirus epidemic, turning it into a pandemic, it started in mid-January. Now, when we look at the cluster that there was at that time, Jupiter entered Capricorn in early December. And by the time we got to that mid-January point, it's about something like 6, 7, 8 degrees of Capricorn. So not too far away from the Saturn Pluto conjunction. But of course, as things have moved on, we can really see how this trio of planets have been working. Now, remember on my other videos, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, which is in 3 parts, I talked about the Saturn-Pluto conjunction being about boundaries, the reformation of boundaries. But I'm especially interested in that idea of boundaries at this point, of Saturn's limitations, its factor in astrology to do with borders. And what's happening, of course, is that we're seeing borders close now. We are seeing the restrictions that our circumstances have imposed upon us. And again, looking at that triple conjunction, Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto in Capricorn, it's really translated perfectly into the circumstances all of us find ourselves in. There isn't a person on the globe that isn't affected by this idea of containment, both in the sense of initially trying to contain the virus, but also of containment and restraint and boundaries now being closed, whether you're trying to get out or whether you're trying to get in. So we see this massive triple conjunction as a process we're working through. We're living through our astrology. Again, an interesting point. Today, as I speak to you, the 22nd of March, Saturn entered Aquarius. It's going to only be in Aquarius for about 3 months till the end of June. But during that time, we're going to have a little taster of what it means. And when we think about Aquarius, we think about hopes and dreams. We think about humanitarian issues, the brotherhood of man. We think about collaborations. We think about enterprise. Now, Saturn coming into Aquarius has also shown us now society, our desire for brotherhood and connection with other people is now severely limited. We have, don't we, this sense of isolation, social isolation, and that is absolutely Saturn in Aquarius. So it would be interesting to see that as Saturn comes out of Aquarius, as it will do, later on in June, do we see maybe a little freeing up of that self-isolation? We can but hope. I've also addressed this whole cycle of time, looking at it all the way through to January 2021, because of the shadow cycles we're in. The shadow cycle of Saturn, which will end in 2021, January. The same with Pluto and the same with Jupiter. So we have that yardstick to judge this whole event, this pandemic, the worldwide effect of what it's doing to us all. We have smaller cycles and bigger cycles. So I just wanted to mention Saturn in Aquarius in that way, rather than taking you through all its various manifestations. But I think too, what we need to look with Saturn in Aquarius is that idea of enterprise. I mean, although enterprise appears to have been halted in a way because, businesses have suffered so greatly and transportation and travel have really, disenabled that process. But let's think too that out of those forced circumstances, new enterprise will come. And I'll touch on that a little bit as I go through the 12 signs, because I want to do that a little bit, because I think it's important that we get an idea that this can be a constructive time. I mean, certainly I'm not the only person saying this is a wake up for humanity call. On my website, I have a link to a very short video by Jane Goodall, who's the primatologist and the anthropologist, who talks very much about the animals being part of our planet. And we are taking away, or we have done over the decades, destroyed their environment, and they have suffered. And now we're suffering the effects of that from the animals which the virus began in. So we can see this whole, spiritual, philosophical way. We can see this time that we're in is a great lesson for humanity. It's a lesson for governments and nations, and hopefully out of this shared challenge, this shared tumult, we can find a unity. There's purpose in that. And I think in our individual lives as well, we have the same challenge, that in itself that we will find growth, because we will have to draw on resources we didn't even know we had. But let me take a little look at Jupiter and Pluto through the signs. So it gives you a sort of little extra take on what it means if you're an Aries or if you're Pisces or whatever sign you are. And I'm going to have to make sure I don't miss a sign out, because as you know, I do this off the cuff. I don't have a nice little idiot screen here telling me what next to say. So I don't want to miss any sign out. So I'm going to start, first of all, with Aries. Now, the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction for you is in the 10th house. Now, this is the area of career and life direction and status. So we could be looking at Jupiter-Pluto's bright face, in the sense that a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction will transform your status and it will transform your career potential. Maybe this means that you'll find fame through this current Jupiter-Pluto cycle. Or maybe we have the reverse that we're looking at, and what we find instead is that loss of status and that loss of what we used to do for a living. But what's offered us here is the idea of reinventing what we do, reinventing our life goals. And interestingly enough, I think, although it's not an exact translation of the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, but I think this notion of what's authentic is important. It isn't a payback that if you've lost your status or the way you used to work, that used to give you a particular income and a particular style of life and gave you a set of life goals that were on track for one thing, if that's all changed now in a negative way, you haven't deserved that. It's just a process. It's just that maybe you need to find new resources and new meaning and find what is authentic and not what is inauthentic. So if we move now to Taurus, and the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction is in the 9th house for you. It's the area of far horizons. Now, in a normal situation, we might say this is a year to travel greatly, to go from one ends of the earth to the other, to see how different societies live, different cultures. Now, of course, you don't have to travel physically in terms of miles to do that. What is offered here is the opportunity to explore such things, to explore wide horizons through other means, most notably, of course, the internet. But maybe, too, we need to look at the idea that our far horizons are how we see our life evolving over the decades, and maybe our trajectory, our view, if we're taught this, requires change. We have a new set of possibilities now. So in a good way, maybe this too will be transformed. But if suddenly you've been cut off from people, maybe you have family living in far-flung places, or your job involves international travel or things like that, that's fundamentally changed. But it requires of you to change and adapt to this new circumstances, find new things that will become the norm in future times. And I think particularly with Taurus, although this affects all the fixed signs, Scorpio, Leo, and Aquarius, is the idea that you have to drop the attachment. So in your case, it's dropping the attachment to the future you hoped for. Once you've dropped the attachment, all sorts of possibilities are opened up. And so now we come to Gemini and the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in the 8th house. Now, of course, the 8th house is this very mysterious scorpionic area where we think about the occult, we think about death and rebirth and, all those kind of mystical things. But on a slightly more mundane level, the 8th house is the area, or it shows us emotional, sexual, and financial exchange. So on one hand, we could be looking at the idea of a huge amount of money and trade and financial exchange going on, massive with the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. And we must remember that while most people, and maybe even most Geminis, are now facing an uncertain economic future, there are some who are making an enormous amount of income from this by probably not necessarily monetary desires, but through even humanitarian desires or the state of the way the world is or your environment is. But let's also think about emotional and sexual exchange. Sometimes it's difficult for Gemini to drop the barriers and be open to intimacy. And in dropping that fear and allowing the boundaries to collapse, I suppose that's a Saturnian thing as well. Look at the richness you'll find through being open to intimacy. But maybe it also means for some Geminis, the loss of that intimacy. And why might that happen? It's because you are removed from the people or the person that you are most intimate with. And therefore you have to draw upon other resources in order to not fill that gap, but to add a different quality to that sense of emotional and sexual exchange. If we come to Cancer, of course, we're looking at that Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in the 7th house of partnership. And Jupiter and Pluto could bring about a wonderful expansion of that ability to relate so that you have the opportunity to meet someone who will totally transform your life by your falling in love with them or with your working with them, however you're going to view partnership. That's a massive thing. But so too can we see, and this is going to be a test of a lot of signs and a lot of relationships in life, that it's only through the most challenging of experience can a relationship be truly tested. So that tests of relationships will be found in this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in the 7th house. It's, as I said to somebody who I was replying to a question about, it truly is, do you love this person in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer? And that is what that Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in the 7th house is all about. Now, when we come to Leo, we're looking at the 6th house. And the 6th house is this rather grey area of astrology that we have this label on it, work and health. Okay, Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in the area of work and health. Does this mean you're going to have an absolutely super period for work? Does it mean that you're going to be inundated with opportunities to work? Does it mean that your health will grow from strength to strength because of the measures you're now taking to be healthy and fit? Well, yes, it could. But it could also mean the reverse of that, so that your work situation radically changes. And of course, we know that's true because so many of us in all corners of the world are working from home now. We don't go into the office anymore. We don't go into the workplace. And we think about health as well. Yes, maybe too, that effect of having to really be resistant to whatever virus is doing the rounds is an important part of this Jupiter-Pluto process. But the 6th house is also an area of service. It's where we give ourselves over to others. And maybe sometimes when we think about Leo, which is a very creative, a sign of the self, which is why so many stars and celebrities and creative artists and performers have planets and points in Leo, because it is the self giving of the self in performance. But maybe what Leo has to learn now is selflessness. So others are put before yourself, and that in that act comes great transformation. And I'll be talking about that as I wrap up this video. Now, if we come to Virgo, we see the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in the area of self. It is the 5th house. So what this may offer is the opportunity to star. What does it mean to star in your neighborhood, to star in your family, to star out there on the world stage or the internet stage? Maybe it does. It's the opportunity to find the self and to transform the self through what you do creatively. For artists who are already working in creative mediums, this may be a burgeoning period for the best they can do. Artists who are painters, sculptors, actors, musicians, dancers, bringing out the very greatest of performance and art. But not everybody can do that. But there's being creative in our life, being creative with solutions and putting oneself in that role of being the creator is important. So maybe that's the upside of a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, where things seem to have changed and transformed so radically that we're forced on our own reserves. And Virgo, of course, is a very self-deprecating sign. You tend to work behind the scenes. So the idea that this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction is pushing you in the forefront, where you have to be the self, to come up with solutions and take charge, that's quite a challenge and a good thing. So here we come to Libra. And for you, the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction is at the roots of life. It is home and family. Well, I've already mentioned the idea of everything changing in the workplace. We have to work at home. So the home becomes the place for a Jupiter-Pluto experience. Lots of things going on here. Maybe new members of the family, so that you're transformed because the family is now bigger than it was. Or maybe because family is all over the place and can't visit certain members of the family is transformed in that way. And maybe the home itself has to be transformed. Maybe you're going to have to knock walls down and add something so that it can house more members of the family. This is just a very practical sense of Jupiter and Pluto. But let's not look at that alone. We look here for Jupiter and Pluto. Remember, Jupiter is about wisdom, the getting of wisdom. And Pluto, that idea of all that magnification of it all, that this puts family relationships under the microscope. And maybe with Libra, so much about relating is not exactly cerebral, but it's sort of analysis. It's debating, it's balance, it's sort of, non-judgmental. And what Libra has to do is get down there really into the nitty gritty of family relationships and really hunker down in there. And maybe that's the challenge, and that's also the reward. It's both things. Remember, on my year ahead, those of you who've got my year ahead this year, I talk about challenges and rewards. So here we come to Scorpio. And here we've got the 3rd house, Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in the 3rd house. And I think the expansion of knowledge is very important here. And one of the opportunities offered by this extraordinary time we're in, where we're cut off from our normal kind of life, our style of life, our existence, that what we can really expand is our skills, our understanding, our knowledge. And that's going to be the advantage of this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. And maybe if it's the right time and that Jupiter-Pluto conjunction hits your chart, it's your time to become a mentor, maybe even a mentor on a mass scale to the world, so that your mentorship skills, the knowledge that you're handing on to others, is now on a huge scale, much bigger than ever it was. But so too is the opposite of that maybe if you're used, say, to teaching in a university or having a really big platform to spread your ideas, that's all changed because we can't travel anywhere. We can't gather in groups where thousands of people can hear. what you're saying, that has to transform as well and find a new medium in which to do that. So the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in general is forcing us to find new resources. One last thing about Scorpio as well, because it's on that fixed cross, is the idea of attachment. You have to drop your attachment to results, your attachment to things that you thought would be. Just drop it, because by dropping attachment, you free yourself up and you free up possibilities. And so here we now come. Thank goodness I've got my little map here. This is what I'm doing. I'm going around like this. So here we've got Scorpio, and now we have Sagittarius. That Jupiter-Pluto conjunction for you is in the second house of self-worth. And this is both income and finance, and it's also how other people value you and your sense of self-value. So while some Sagittarians will see their income transformed in the sense that you'll make bogs of money and that your income will expand, for a lot of Sagittarians, it's totally the reverse, and there's a huge loss of income. But hey, what does it mean? It means now finding new resources with which to earn money, and maybe even new resources with which to acquire that value in yourself. And you know, one of the things that we really gain when we're hard pressed, when circumstances are really difficult for us and we have to draw on our reserves of strength and knowledge and wisdom and kindness, all those things, is that we become better people. And we value ourselves when we become better people. So that's a challenge and both a joy in a way from that Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. For Capricorn, well, of course, it's in your sign. And for the last 2.5 years, you know, Saturn trundling through Capricorn, Pluto nearing the end of its journey through Capricorn. It's been tough for Team Capricorn. There hasn't been a lot of effortlessness. Everything has taken time. Things have been lost. And when we think about that Saturnian principle in Capricorn, the idea that we're having to be forced on our reserves because things have been blocked off. You haven't been able to go along that route. So now with Jupiter, that just increases the volume. It ups and ramps up the volume of that. So for some Capricorns, there's this breakthrough in the blocks and the difficulties that you've experienced with that Saturn-Pluto conjunction, the release of it, the joy of what it's all meant. But yes, again, we look at the idea of Jupiter ramping up whatever you've got with that Pluto in your sign as well. So it is also facing a lot of transformation in a not very pleasant way. But hey, what's trying to happen here? Transformation at core level in your deepest self, because that's where everything transforms. When we transform ourselves at core level, we become literally different people. It is a great kind of spiritual process here of transforming ourselves in order for life to be transformed and the world to be transformed. So when we think of our circumstances that may be negative and difficult, we grab hold of that experience, that set of circumstances, and my goodness, we get to them at our core level and deal with them, and so are transformed by them. So almost the end of the zodiac, we come to the penultimate sign, we come to Aquarius, and we find that Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in the 12th house. And the 12th house is the house of the unconscious mind. It's a very mysterious area. So sometimes it's very difficult for us to know what the purpose is or the process is when we've got a 12th house transit. But I like the idea of the enrichment. In Capricorn's case, we see it at core level. In Aquarius's terms, we've got it at consciousness, the level of consciousness. So very consciousness is being transformed by these circumstances. I also see this as important for Aquarius, the Jupiter-Pluto gift of the expansion and transformation that we get from it, in the sense this is preparation for something to come. And maybe we're looking at 2021 and beyond for Aquarians to see where this current period is taking us. And I think if you can look at life in the sense of it's a preparation for the next chapter, and if you think of that in terms of what's going on in your life and see it as a positive process, no matter what the circumstances are, and see it as transforming your consciousness, it becomes active, it becomes purposeful, and definitely enriching. Last but not least, Pisces. Pisces, we're in the area of the 11th house, which is communities, it's groups, it's humanity, it's collaborations, enterprise, all those things. We find a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction would make this a massive growth period, so that your community will grow, so that your ability to collaborate will grow massively, and your entrepreneurial skills will expand in proportion and transform your existence. But hey, we look at the circumstances we're in and we think, well, we can't get out to meet anyone, where we've got that social isolation going on. But there are lots of different ways to explore that idea of networking, of bringing humanity together. And in the process of working for others, of course, we work for ourselves as well. And that's a big message for generally everybody, but I think particularly for Leo and Aquarius, Virgo and Pisces, who are on that axis, generally speaking, in the idea of what we seek in the self, we now give to others. A sense of service that we attach to our life and our work, we give to others. And that's also a message with this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn for Pisces. I also think the idea of entrepreneurialism, sometimes it has a rather negative tone, doesn't it? We think of entrepreneurs as being rather greedy people. But of course, entrepreneurs are very creative in the main. They come up with creative solutions. And the idea you've got this Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in your 11th house is a wonderful way to suddenly find yourself as an entrepreneur. And if you've lost your normal outlet for businesses or whatever you do as a sole trader or whatever, my goodness, will this transform the opportunity for you to bring new businesses, new entrepreneurial ventures into being? So I have gone through the 12 signs, and I hope that's sort of given you a little bit more of a grip on what we're looking at. And remember, this is a year's process. It isn't just today. This Jupiter-Pluto conjunction is a year-long thing. And so we'll be experiencing different dimensions of it and different purposes of it as we go through these next 9 months at least. And I wanted to end really by the idea of, what this current experience viewed through this Jupiter-Pluto lens can do. We feel we've all been separated from our lives. We've been separated from normal routines, in some cases, the people we love. But what is offered here is the community itself, is this idea that now we become a unity, a greater unity. Through our difficult times, we become united by our circumstances, and we can see that nation to nation as much as we can with our smaller environment, our smaller selves. And I think out of that will come a new sense of bonding, humanity bonding. And although we seem to be in this stage where borders are closing and we've got this big idea that trespassers, will be prosecuted, we've got rampant xenophobia going on, that will change, because we will see the world as an entity and barriers will be broken, even if that's in terms of consciousness and the rest of it, rather than physical boundaries. But I think I also wanted to look at the idea that what's being offered to us at this time, and I mentioned it a couple of times when I was going through the zodiac, is that this idea that we do think about ourselves and the people closest to us when we go through something like this. We fear for the people we love, and we fear for ourselves. It's natural, completely natural. But in doing for others, in actually going out and selflessly working for others, we actually get over our fear and we help ourselves in that process. So I think, although we don't like what's going on right now, there will be great transformations of all of us. And of course, we think about the transformation of science as well, in that we will find a cure for this. We will find a vaccine for this. And this will also pave the way for greater knowledge. Remember, let's forget that Jupiter is about wisdom and knowledge. And all this is happening on a Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. And so there are great strides to be made in that regard as well. So yes, I'm sitting here. Seems as though nothing's changed. I'm here as usual. But of course, everything has changed. I'm actually even in a new place. Some of you will spot this. We're not looking at the same room. And indeed, I have moved somewhere. So that's a transformation to me. I had to leave my home. So, and these times that we're living in, I think normality is important. So we make routines out of our normal life, our new normal life. So we do things at certain times. We create a new routine. That's another way of finding security and stability in a kind of very abnormal time. So I leave you, I hope, with hope. I'm not leaving you in fear. That's the last thing I want to do. Fear is so negative. We have to be fearless and look forward, because we will come through this time. And this idea that astrology can teach us so much about what's going on, it's a language in itself, is a wonderful thing. That's my gift to you, my selfless service to you. So until we meet again, until my next video here, take great care, but be fearless.